Imagine a marathon where the winner hitched a ride in a car for 11 miles. Imagine a race where the actual gold medalist was carried across the finish line by his handlers, hallucinating and technically dead on his feet, fueled not by water, but by a mixture of brandy and rat poison. Imagine a course so dusty that runners coughed up blood, and where the competitors included a Cuban mailman who lost his money in a dice game and ran in dress shoes, and two Tswana tribesmen who were chased a mile off course by wild dogs. This wasn't a fever dream. This was the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis, Missouri. It remains, to this day, the strangest sporting event in American history.
Part 1. The stage is set. The year was 1904. America was bustling with the industrial optimism of the turn of the century. St. Louis had captured the world's attention by hosting the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the World's Fair, a sprawling celebration of human achievement. Attached to this grand spectacle, almost as an afterthought, were the Olympics. Unlike the precise, hyper-organized Olympics of today, the 1904 Games were a chaotic sideshow. The organizers wanted to test the limits of human endurance, but their understanding of sports science was practically medieval. The marathon was scheduled for August 30th. The conditions were hellish. The temperature soared to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius, with humidity thick enough to chew on. But the heat wasn't the only enemy. James Sullivan, the chief organizer of the Games, was a man obsessed with purposeful dehydration. He believed that drinking water during exercise was a sign of weakness. Consequently, for the entire 24.85-mile course, there was only one water station, a dirty well located at the 11-mile mark. The course itself was a disaster. It wasn't a flat track, it was a brutal gauntlet of unpaved roads featuring steep hills. To make matters worse, the organizers allowed cars and horses to drive alongside the runners. In the scorching summer heat, these vehicles kicked up massive clouds of dust, choking the runners and coating their lungs with grime. Part 2. The Cast of Characters. The starting lineup was a motley crew of 32 athletes that looked more like the setup for a bad joke than an Olympic roster. Thomas Hicks, USA, an experienced runner, but one who would soon become the subject of a terrifying medical experiment. Fred Lorz, USA, a bricklayer by trade, a prankster by nature, and a man who didn't take losing lightly. Felix Carvajal, Cuba, a former mailman. He had raised money to come to the U.S. but lost it all in a dice game in New Orleans. He hitchhiked to St. Louis and arrived at the starting line wearing heavy street clothes, a long-sleeve shirt, and dress shoes. A fellow athlete took pity on him and used scissors to cut his trousers into makeshift shorts. And Len Tao and John Mashiani, South Africa. They were not professional athletes, but students who were actually in St. Louis as part of a Boer War reenactment at the World's Fair. They ran barefoot. At 3:03 p.m. in the blistering afternoon sun, the gun went off. Part 3. The chaos begins. From the very first mile, the race devolved into madness. The dust was the first killer. Within a few miles, runners began to drop like flies, coughing and vomiting. The escort cars intended to help were essentially gassing the athletes with exhaust and dirt. The Cuban postman's picnic. Felix Carvajal, running in his cut-off dress pants and heavy shoes, surprisingly found the pace easy. In fact, he found it too boring. Being a chatty man, he frequently stopped running to talk to spectators. He practiced his English, cracked jokes, and then sprinted to catch up with the pack. Around the halfway mark, hunger struck. Carvajal spotted an apple orchard. He hopped the fence and ate a few green apples. Unfortunately, the apples were rotten. Moments later, suffering from severe stomach cramps, the Cuban lay down on the side of the road and took a nap. Despite this detour, he would eventually wake up and continue running. The wild dog incident. Meanwhile, Len Tao and John Masciani were running a respectable race until they encountered a hazard not found in any rulebook: aggressive feral dogs. A pack of dogs chased Len Tao nearly a mile off the designated course. He had to run for his life, literally, just to get back to the race. Amazingly, despite the detour, he would finish 9th.
Part 4. The Cheater. Fred Lorz, the American bricklayer, was leading the pack early on, but by mile 9, the heat broke him. Suffering from severe cramps, he decided to quit. He waved down one of the accompanying automobiles and hopped in, intending to ride back to the stadium to retrieve his clothes. Lorz sat comfortably in the passenger seat, waving at the suffering runners as the car breezed past them. He rode for 11 miles. However, as fate would have it, the car broke down near the 19-mile mark. Refreshed, rested, and with his cramps gone, Lorz decided to run the rest of the way. Just for a joke, he later claimed. He entered the stadium to a roar of applause. He crossed the finish line first with a time of roughly 3 hours. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Teddy Roosevelt, was there to award the gold medal. She was about to place the wreath on Lorz's head when a furious official burst onto the scene, screaming that Lorz was an imposter. Lorz laughed, claiming he was just fooling around, but the crowd was not amused. He was nearly banned for life, though he was reinstated a year later and actually won the Boston Marathon legitimately. Part 5. The Experiment on Thomas Hicks. While Lorz was playing his prank, the real race was turning into a horror show for Thomas Hicks. By mile 10, Hicks was exhausted. He wanted to quit. His handlers, however, refused to let him stop. They were not just coaches, they were experimenting with performance-enhancing techniques of the era. When Hicks begged for water, they sponged his mouth with warm distilled water but refused to let him drink. When he began to stagger at mile 17, his trainers decided to administer medicine. They pulled out a syringe containing strychnine sulfate, essentially rat poison, mixed with egg whites. In small doses, strychnine acts as a stimulant for the nervous system. In larger doses, it kills you. Hicks took the poison. He perked up briefly, his legs moving mechanically, but soon his face turned ashen gray. He began to hallucinate. He believed the finish line was still 20 miles away. At mile 20, his trainers gave him another dose of strychnine, this time washed down with a swig of brandy. Part 6. The Finish Line of the Walking Dead. By the time Hicks entered the stadium, he was no longer running, he was shuffling. His upper body hung limp, his eyes rolled back in his head. His trainers literally held him up by his arms, dragging his feet above the ground as his legs continued to make a running motion in the air. He was hallucinating vividly, believing he was running on air. The combination of heat stroke, dehydration, alcohol, and rat poison had brought him to the very edge of death. With one final, agonizing effort, his trainers carried/dragged him across the finish line. He collapsed immediately. Doctors rushed to the scene. It took 4 doctors and an hour of emergency treatment to ensure he didn't die right there on the track. He had lost 8 pounds during the race. Thomas Hicks was declared the winner. Part 7. The Aftermath. The results of the 1904 marathon were staggering. Thomas Hicks won gold, surviving the poison. Albert Corey, a French immigrant who arrived without papers and was told he had to run for USA, won silver. Arthur Newton took bronze. Felix Carvajal, the Cuban mailman who stopped to chat and eat rotten apples, finished 4th. If he hadn't taken that nap, he likely would have won gold. Out of 32 starters, only 14 finished. It was a race defined by amateurism, cruelty, and absurdity. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon changed the way the world viewed endurance sports, mostly by showing everyone exactly how not to do it. It remains a testament to the strange, indomitable, and occasionally foolish spirit of the early 20th century.